CHI's Existential Detective Fiction class. We are in week 4, finishing up with Fichte's Vocation of Man, looking at the topic of faith and vocation. And this all does pay off by the end of the class. It will all come together. So I appreciate your faith in wading through 19th century German philosophy. As a little bit of review, last week we discussed the nature of consciousness and the philosophical ground for knowledge, which is emptiness. The I of Fichte's text was appalled at how this perspective, which anchored everything within the nature of subjective consciousness, eliminated a participation with anything real. Both the self and the world were transformed into a series of images that were fragmentary and disconnected. The price for certain knowledge and freedom from determinism was a break from reality. For this week, in this section, Fichte introduces faith as a product of the will. He listens to the initial promptings of will, mentioned in the first chapter on doubt, and allows himself to engage with the world without any certainty. The vocation of the human being is connected to this willing. It avoids both nihilism, which is the first part, and solipsism, which was the second part. Further, it introduces the meaning for knowledge into the equation. Knowledge is important as a means toward acting and not as a good for its own sake. His discussion of faith then leads into ethics, politics, justice, and religion. It's the most open form of living for him. What grounds this? It's still grounded in thinking as an activity. He has an activity. Willing is a type of thinking that brings something new into being. On page 68, he discovers this in the origin of his own voice. In becoming self-conscious, he can understand consciousness to be a free willing. So that's where we're headed into. So we start with page 67. And again, we have that plaintive existential voice of the I speaking. And he says, "Your discussion has crushed me, terrible spirit, but you refer me to myself. And what would I be if anything outside of me could irretrievably crush me? I will surely follow your advice. What are you looking for, my lamenting heart? What is it that rouses your indignation against a system to which my intellect cannot make the slightest objection? This. I want something which lies beyond mere mental presentations. Nothing exists anywhere outside my mind is a thought which natural sense considers ridiculously stupid, a thought which no human being could assert with complete seriousness, and which requires no refutation. For the educated judgment, which knows the deep reasons for it, it is a crushing and annihilating thought." So that's how he introduces the section. And what he does is reject the claims on knowledge on human grounds and not merely intellectual ones. So he looks at, he gestures toward the anthropology of the human, of which the intellect is a part, but it is not the whole. And on human grounds, he has to reject the appeal of knowledge and the appeal of certainty as being inhumane. He can't live with it. Even if the human is a uniquely thinking being, it does not mean that humans can thrive on mere thought alone. Does that make sense? Okay. Continuing. He says, "Your vocation is not merely to know, but to act according to your knowledge. This is what I clearly hear in my inmost soul as I collect myself for a moment and pay attention to myself. You exist for activity. Your activity, and your activity alone, determines your worth. This is key. Action differs from thought because it requires investing oneself in the world, instead of remaining free from it in mental isolation or determined by it in ways that make one a mere object within the world. It is through action that we realize our being as humans." Okay? So then he continues forward. "This voice leads me out of mental presentations, out of mere knowledge, to something which lies outside of it, and it is its complete opposite, to something which is more and higher than all knowledge, and contains the final purpose of knowledge itself within it. This voice then announces to me precisely what I was looking for, something lying outside of knowledge and in its being quite independent of it." Okay, so he's broken free from the world of thought, and he's once more engaged with the world, but it's not the world which acts upon him in a deterministic way. The function of will is to allow him a door to enter into the world and become integrated with it in a way that's meaningful and not determined. That's what he needs to be able to do. So in the passage I just read, there are two claims, both of which are worthy of note. One, knowledge should be seen as a means to an end and not an end in itself. To know as an end of itself is empty. You can know a lot of things and it's just It's just empty at the heart of it. It's proven to be an unsatisfying end after all. Second, Fichte is still relying on his internal voice for guidance, the voice that steered away from both the knowledge of determinism and the knowledge of absolute freedom. So hidden throughout the book are those moments of that inmost voice or that prompting that urges him to think about his vocation in the first place and steers him away from these other paths. And at the end of it, that's the notion of he uses the word soul sometimes, but it's mostly a voice. It's something that he hears internally that directs him toward some things and away from other things. And it seems that Fichte is hoping that the reader understands that that voice is something integral to what it means to be human. It's something that can't be reduced to knowing, but it's something that some large part of being that allows for a more direct way of acting in the world humanly. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 68. He reflects on this. What is the origin of that voice in me which directs me beyond presentations? There is in me a drive to absolute independent self-activity. I find nothing more intolerable than only to be in another, for another, and through another. I want to be and become something for and through myself. This drive is indivisibly united with the consciousness of myself. So he's saying that to think of the self or to develop some sort of intentional self-consciousness will always irreducibly include something like that voice within it, right? A voice that wills one to be part of one's own end and to have it be a meaningful end or an important end or a valuable end. He continues, in keeping with this drive, I ought to act as an absolutely independent being. That is how I apprehend and translate that drive. I am to be independent. Who am I? Subject and object in one. We talked about that last week, right? How you can make yourself an object of consciousness and still be the thinker. So for him, he's subject and object in one, the omnipresent knower and known under the same logic, the intuiting and intuited, same logic, the thinker and the thought at once. He doesn't want to be wholly severed from reality, because that's too much independence. That's what Spirit was telling him, right? He can be wholly independent, but that's not what he wants. He wants to engage with things, but to have it be with, not determined by. So on page 69, he continues. I conceive of my independence as I in the following manner, therefore. I ascribe to myself the capacity to originate a concept simply because I originate it. To originate this concept because I originated in the absolute sovereignty of myself as intelligence. Right? So it's not wholly deterministic. The thinking I can originate things that are unprompted by outside forces. I further ascribe to myself the capacity to exhibit this concept through a real act outside the concept. And that gets it out of chapter 2 in that tangle, right? Because the real act brings it into the world in a way that's meaningful and shared. A real effective power of bringing forth being, which is something quite different from the mere capacity of concepts. Here is the point to which the consciousness of all reality is connected. The real efficacy of my concept and the real power to act, which in consequence of that efficacy I must ascribe to myself, is that point. In the meantime, let things be as they may with the reality of the sensible world outside of me. I have reality and I apprehend it. It lies in me and is native to myself. So this is how he's trying to untangle that mess that Spirit made. And he's saying that, or he's realizing that the meaning of freedom isn't freedom. It's not freedom for the sake of freedom, because there's emptiness to that. The meaning of freedom is the ability to matter in the world. Mattering, like matter, requires materialization. It's not the abstract power to think reality, it's the efficacy that emerges when engaging with reality and thereby being able to alter it. That's what freedom means. Does that difference make sense?
Would you say that all again?
Yeah. The meaning of freedom isn't freedom, it's the ability to matter in the world. Mattering requires materialization, which requires the efficacy of acting and having one's acts affect and change and shape things around you. Page 70. So this sounds great. It does. But the I nonetheless doubts the veracity of this drive, and he wants to ensure that it's not merely a repetition of the emptiness of spirit. He says, quote, "Do I really feel, or do I only think I feel? What can prevent speculation from asking such questions and from continuing to ask them indefinitely? What can I answer, and where is there a point at which I could call a halt to its questions?" Right? So again, the drive to certainty still calls, but that need for certainty will always presuppose asking more and more questions and never letting them move forward. So knowing that the path of doubt pushes towards certainty that becomes unbearable, Fichte outlines another path. Quote, "I know that if with this system I don't want to play another confusing game, but really want to live by it, I will have to refuse obedience to that inner voice. I cannot want it to act, for according to that system I cannot know whether I can act. My life will then be purged of all seriousness and interest. Shall I refuse obedience to that inner voice? I will not. I will freely give myself the determination which that drive indicates in me, and in this resolution I will at the same time seize the thought of its reality and truthfulness, and of the reality of everything it presupposes." So he looks to that drive towards certainty and says, I'm not going to play by those rules. I need to act. I need to live. And living requires an efficacious understanding of my acting in the world, of it mattering, of it making a difference. The alternative then that he puts out is faith. And that's the title of this chapter. He says, quote, "Now I understand you, sublime spirit. I have found the means by which to take hold of this reality, and with it probably at the same time to all the rest of reality. Knowledge is not this means. No knowledge can be its own foundation and proof." Right? Because that's just tautological. You can't prove something using itself as evidence. Everything knowledge presupposes something still higher as its foundation, and this ascent has no end. It is faith, this voluntary acquiescence in the view which naturally presents itself to us, because only on this view can we fulfill our vocation. It is that which first gives approval to knowledge and raises to certainty and conviction what without it could be mere deception. Faith is no knowledge, but a decision of the will to recognize the validity of knowledge. And that's the point at which he ends up needing to stop. Faith undercuts the intellect's need for certainty and wills to forge ahead in spite of not knowing, in all capital letters, whether or not things are true, real, or only apparent. It allows for action instead of mere speculation. Does that make sense? At some point, if knowledge is always going to demand more and more proof, what he wants to do is cut to the chase and say, at some point, I just have to say this is enough. And that's my will that will do that. But my ability to say that that's good enough is an act of faith. It's not knowledge, it's just faith. Fichte then goes on to discuss the further advantages of faith, and that's, again, part of what's unfolding throughout this chapter then. He says, "I will not take part in disputation, for I see in advance that nothing can be gained by it. I will not allow myself to be confused by it, because the source of my conviction is higher than all disputation." Right? Knowledge is the world of disputation. His conviction, or his certainty, lies outside of all those kind of mirror games of doubt, 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 doubt. It wouldn't occur to me to want to foist this conviction onto another person with arguments, right? So his act of faith isn't one that demands that he convince other people that it's true. That's okay. Quote, "I have adopted my way of thinking initially for myself and only want to justify it for myself. Once I know this, I also know the point of departure for all education of myself as well as others. It is the will, not the intellect. If only the former is steadily and sincerely directed at the good, the latter will of itself apprehend the true. If only the latter is exercised, if only the intellect is exercised, nothing more will come of it than a facility for racking one's brain with intellectual quibbling, which leads to nothing. Bare cognition carried out with logical thoroughness only leads to the insight that we can know nothing." And this sets up, again, a different kind of anthropology, one that admits that life, as we know it as human beings, allows no absolute certainty. Independence is willing what one believes in ways that inspire acting in the world. It's establishing the relationship with the world one desires, not one framed by mere necessity. because that's the deterministic view, and that's also unsatisfying. Fichte next claims that this is universal and not an idiosyncratic conclusion, right? So on the one hand, he doesn't want to convince anybody else of what he himself believes, because it's an act of faith, and it only has to be valid for him. At the same time, he wants to systematically explain that realization of that moment has to be true for all people. It's not just that he's kind of quirky. So he says, it is no different with any human being. Without being aware of it, they apprehend all reality which is there for them only by faith. And this faith imposes itself upon them together with their existence, innate in them all. Okay? And just really quick, I'm going to jump backward to Kant and then move forward. So what Kant set up in the Critique of Pure Reason was a distinction that separated opinion, belief, or faith, in German it's both Glaube, and knowledge. And this has nothing in itself to do with God. I mean, faith is commonly just equated to religion. This is in terms of modes of knowing or understanding. So opinion is where you have where you don't have conviction, where there's no conviction, and there's no certainty. I think the weather's supposed to be good tomorrow. I don't have certainty. I don't have conviction. I just think so. I think the Hawkeyes will probably win Saturday. I don't know. Maybe, right? Belief is where you have conviction, which is subjective, right? This is what I think. That's that thinking I. But there's no certainty about it that's validated by the external world. Knowledge is where you have conviction and you have certainty. You know, today the high was 78 or whatever it was, right? I can say that with conviction and with certainty. I know what the temperature was. I don't know what it will be tomorrow. Does that distinction make sense?
So conviction doesn't have anything to do with how strongly you feel about it.
It's only how strongly you feel. Okay. Certainty has nothing to do with how strongly you feel. It's just if it can be empirically determined. Okay. Right? That's certainty. Conviction is how strongly you feel about it. So opinions, you know, I think Bernie Sanders has a shot. That's an opinion. Not really convinced, not really certain. It's an opinion that I hold. But there are people who very much believe that Bernie Sanders will make a good president, right? They're not certain about it because those are also the people who thought Obama would make a good president. And some of them are disappointed. Some of them, you know, people have different opinions on that, again, or different beliefs about it. But nobody has knowledge about it because that can't yet be borne out. Does that make sense? So when he's talking faith or belief, this is what he's talking about. Make sense?
Because he's saying that knowledge is like a pretty wretched place to be at.
You can't have this unless you're going to be totally self-absorbed in that kind of fragmentary world of spirit, right? That's the only thing you can be certain about is empty knowledge, which doesn't matter in the world, right? And so to get out of that kind of certainty or the deterministic kind of certainty, which is also a kind of certainty, to break free from that, this is where you have to be. But you don't want to lack conviction at the same time, right? You want to have conviction because that's what allows you to act and uphold your vocation. And that's why he just kind of rests on faith as his orientation. You okay with that? All right. 73. What is it that holds them captive in that first natural view? It's not reasons, for there are none that can do it. Rather, it's their interest in a reality they want to produce. The good person simply to produce it. The common sensual person to enjoy it. In other words, acknowledging faith provides a volitional space that lets our love, care, desire, and interest to emerge as primary and not just expendable elements in our lives. Remember at the beginning of doubt, like that's what was agonizing. It felt like his knowledge and his love were at odds. And in faith, he says, no, let love emerge as what's primary. That which impassions me into the world and not as something I can discard. Because love is that which is most human about me. And that will lead the way. But in order for that to lead the way, I can't be certain of anything. I need faith. As humans, in other words, we're captivated by our urgings and desires, not by external elements. That's what prompts us. That's where our convictions emerge. Does that make sense? Okay. So admitting faith into the system then allows the narrator to see the self as a single entity instead of a divided mind-body entity. Further, Fichte shows how admitting faith allows one control over the drives and promptings which would otherwise control us. We gain self-knowledge of who we are, and we can simultaneously receive and produce who we are in a conscious relation to our drives. He says, quote, "All our thinking is founded on our drives, and as an individual's inclinations are, so is his knowledge. These drives impose a certain way of thinking upon us only as long as we don't see the compulsion. But compulsion disappears as soon as it's seen." We'll see that in a couple of weeks with Freud also. I mean, that's Freud's basic thesis with psychotherapy, that once you see the reason of the drive itself disappears. They only act when they remain unconscious, not when you bring them to a conscious level. But compulsion disappears as soon as it's seen, and now it is no longer the drives which shape our way of thinking through themselves, but it is we ourselves who, in keeping with our drives, shape our own way of thinking. And again, that ability to shape your own way of thinking, that's his vocation. That's freedom. That's independence. That's what he's looking for. Does that argument make sense? Okay. So then he goes to vocation, and he returns to his original question, what is my vocation? And he says, quote, "I am to come to know myself thoroughly. I am to see that compulsion. That is my vocation. I am therefore to shape my own way of thinking for myself and will to do so necessarily. I will then be absolutely independent, having completed and prepared myself. The innermost spirit of my spirit is not an alien spirit, but is simply produced by myself in the truest sense of the word. I am thoroughly my own creation. I did not want to be nature, but my own work, and I have become so by willing it. The way of thinking," and by the way, Nietzsche picks up on a lot of that too, right? The notion of self-creation and the drive of will that enables one's self-creation to affirm one's own being in that way. I mean, some of that's also, I mean, Fichte wrote first, of course, but I mean, it's still present in this way of thinking about what it means to be who you are. The way of thinking which I have carefully, intentionally, and with consideration chosen because I recognized it to be the only one appropriate to my dignity and vocation. I accept what my nature also says, but I do not accept it because I must. Rather, I believe it because I want to. Right? It's not necessary. He desires it, and he listens to that desire, which allows him to will it to be so. In this passage, Fichte synthesizes the natural and rational drives through volition or will. This allows him the option of participating in a work that's chosen, even if that choice is prompted, or even if the choice is to adhere to the promptings of his own internal drive, right? He still chooses to follow this prompting rather than that one, and he wills it to be so. What this does is ground the intellect, and it fuses the natural and rational worlds through participation and consent. Right? There's no longer an inner strife or animosity. In willing to himself to follow those promptings, he allows it to be his choice, his desire, and his thinking that are all intertwined. It's really kind of a beautiful and powerful way of thinking about what we can be as ourselves. But it still requires a lot of existential detective work, right? Who am I? What is my vocation? What are my drives? What are my urgings? What are my promptings? Which ones will I follow? What does it mean to be who I am? And those are all things that he's asking that we think through. Yeah.
Well, what is the air then of Oedipus? I mean, is he stuck on certainty and knowledge, or how do you apply this? Because I don't know if belief would have saved him either, right?
He's looking the whole framework is framed in knowledge, though, right? His parents knew that this would happen. He knew that he would do these things, and so he left, right? I mean, the whole framework of the Greek system that Sophocles is writing in is a deterministic one that's predicated on absolute knowledge. And it doesn't allow any wiggle room for freedom. And even when there's the illusion of freedom, like, oh, I'm doing this on my own, they end up falling back on this framework of like, oh, I knew that it would be this way. It's been predetermined. I have no freedom. My freedom was an illusion. So we'll keep that thought in the back of your mind. I'm hoping to explain it here. And then also in the final week of this class, we're going to go back through Oedipus and read back through it with all of the theorists in mind that we've thought through and see how that plays out. So that's the right question to have. Fichte ends the first section of his chapter on faith by reflecting on the orientation of his vocation, where he should direct his thoughts and energies. On 74, he says, what I ought to do and how I can best carry out what I am bidden. All my thoughts must relate to my activity. Apart from that, it is an empty, pointless game, a waste of time and energy, and a perversion of a noble capacity. I may hope, I may surely promise myself to carry on such thinking successfully. The natural world in which I have to act is not an alien being brought about without consideration for me, a being into which I could never penetrate. It is formed by my own laws of thought and must surely agree with them. Everywhere it expresses nothing other than my own relation to myself. So surely as I can hope to know myself, as surely may I promise myself to come to know it. As long as I seek what is my business to seek, I will find. As long as I ask what it is my business to ask, I will receive an answer. It's through faith, through a willingness to act and engage without certainty, that the world's transformed from an alien, hostile place into something that feels more like a home. It's a place of belonging, and a place where one appears to be accepted and acceptable. Not with opposition, but in interdependence or existing in a state of perpetual co-creation. So that's what he's driving for. And then this is a long chapter, so he divides it into 4 books, or 4 chapters within this book. So the first one discusses the need for respect and morality. Here, Fichte looks at some of the further implications of his way of faith and what it means in terms of acting in the world. And he begins with this on page 75. The inner voice in which I believe, and for the sake of which I believe everything else which I believe, does not bid me simply to act, right? I'm not supposed to just do random stuff. This is impossible. To listen to it, to obey it sincerely and unhesitatingly, this is my only vocation. My life ceases to be an empty game without truth and meaning. Only through these commandments of conscience do truth and reality come into my presentations. I cannot refuse them my attention and my obedience without giving up my vocation. Fichte calls his impulse to obey that voice, quote, the first truth and ground of all other truth and certainty. Right? It's an act of faith, but once he makes that act of faith to listen to that voice, within that system, then he can start gaining certainty. Even though that certainty is still predicated on something uncertain, that act of faith. Does that make sense? It's relative certainty. It's an impulse that's not knowledge, and it cannot be proven. It's an initial orientation that requires trust as its first step. The first way that this is important concerns, quote, beings like myself, rational beings. The voice of conscience decrees, quote, whatever these beings may be in and for themselves, you ought to treat them as self-subsistent, free, autonomous beings completely independent of you. Never interfere with the pursuits of these purposes, but rather promote them as much as you can. Respect their freedom. With love, take up their purposes like your own. This is how I ought to act. It's a rehash of the golden rule, right? But it also provides a ground for respect that seems to work pretty well across most cultures. You know, with love, take up others' purposes as your own. Don't impede them in the pursuit of their vocations. Love them. Believe in them. They're beings like you. And you can't prove it, right? They might just be mere appearances or aliens or robots or whatever. But believe that they're human. Treat them with dignity. It's okay. Everything will work out better that way. He then talks about other beings are things devoid of reason that cause need, desire, and enjoyment. But even here, there's a place for conscience to, quote, hallow and at the same time limit this natural drive to enjoy other beings, like animals. They're tasty, but you can still respect them. He discovers that my vocation is to act ethically because, 77, my world is the object and sphere of my duties and absolutely nothing else. Another world or other properties of my world do not exist for me. My whole capacity and any finite capacity is insufficient for apprehending another world. Everything that exists for me imposes its existence and reality in me only through this relation. Right? So he's looking at his world and saying, here's where it is, here's what I have. I have a duty to behave ethically and to respect that which is around me. And that's the end of book 1. We okay with that? Faith is the ground of ethics, morality. You can't know it, but you can believe it. And once you take that act of faith, all the moral, rational principles fall in line. And that's what he's trying to do, is say, here's where you can start things with faith and still be a moral person. Make sense? Okay. Book 2. Here he defines good and evil. He starts out, once again, with his voice. On page 80, quote, I am simply to act in a certain way just because I ought. But he wants to expand this, however, to include purpose. And so here's where he continues. The purpose does not determine the content of the commandment. On the contrary, the immediately given content of the commandment determines the purpose. It opens the prospect of another world to my mind's eye, a world which is really a world, a situation, and not an action, but a different and better world than the one that exists for my sense of sight. It makes me desire this better world. So he switches to investigate the world at hand, natural disasters, meaninglessness, etc., and he blames the fallen nature of the world on, quote, evil uses of freedom. And he explains, it is not nature, it is freedom itself that causes most of the disorders and the most terrible ones among humans. Man's most cruel enemy is man. I mean, that's pretty evident still today. I think it still holds true, maybe. At its worst, though, and in some ways, he discusses injustice within his social order and not just the battlefield. And this is page 84. And I thought this is fairly applicable to the world of 2015 in America. In the interior of states themselves, where people appear to be unified in equality under the law, it is for the most part still cunning and power that rule under the venerable name of law. Here, war is conducted all the more shamefully because it does not declare itself to be war and even deprives the injured party of the privilege of defending himself against unjust powers. Small cliques loudly rejoice over the ignorance, the folly, the depravity, and the misery in which the greater part of their fellows are sunk, and openly make it their chief purpose to keep them in that condition and plunge them down more deeply so as to keep them in slavery forever, and to ruin anyone who might venture to enlighten and improve them. Does that sound familiar? Shockingly so?
I mean, I just read something the other day about, CEOs kind of at a meeting and kind of laughing about how great their pay was, and how much it had grown over, it sounded, in fact, I found this kind of especially depressing that it was that way when he wrote, somehow I wanted to believe maybe we're just in this little scoop of time that, will right itself.
But that power has entrenched itself, and it entrenches itself more deeply. And when you look at what's happening to education systems, especially, I mean, at all levels, I mean, K-12, undergrad, I mean, it's getting the chopping block, and that's a lot of why.
Yeah.
Because the less people have the ability to know, the less people are taught how to think, the easier they are to keep enslaved. So, Fichte's alternative is culture and the humanities. He denies that it's possible that this goes on forever, so there's your hope, right? Unless, quote, the whole of human existence is a purposeless and meaningless game, which it might be, but he doesn't want to think that. His vision is a destiny wherein the species will, quote, unify itself into one single body, thoroughly acquainted with itself and all its parts and everywhere educated the same way. So get to know things, get to know other cultures, get to know people, and have everybody have access to that information. That's page 85. He also adds a need for legal structures and agreements, quote, whereby no one can hope that he will be the one to practice authorized injustice, but each must fear that he will be the one to suffer. Right? So nobody's entitled to act unjustly. Everybody still has to be afraid that they'll be a victim, but nobody has to want to do that. With such laws in place, that focus on the security of neighbors, it would, quote, eliminate the possibility of any just complaint by one state against another, and of every case of self-defense among nations. This would eliminate evil, page 89, because, quote, no human being loves evil because it's evil. He loves in it only the advantages and enjoyments which evil promises, and which in the present state of mankind, it often really grants him. He's optimistic. But you kind of want to believe him. Like he's so earnest about it. But this would eliminate, understanding this about evil opens us to love because on page 90, every disadvantage for an individual, since it can now no longer be an advantage for anyone else, is now a disadvantage for the whole. And that makes sense. And every advance will be progress for all mankind. Each will truly love every other as himself. For Fichte, such a world is, quote, the purpose of our earthly life, which reason prescribes for us. If you're going to think about life rationally, that's what it looks like. That's how it unfolds. Everybody having education, everybody being treated equally, everybody having equal protection under a law, every advance progressing everybody. And it sounds so beautiful and so rational. That's book 2. But it's all an act of faith still, right? It's all a vocation that we will ourselves into, of acting in the world in a certain kind of way. And if everybody had that faith, the world would be a better place. Book 3. In book 3, he introduces the realm of religion into the subject of faith. So he gets there, raising the stakes to a metaphysical level. Fichte anticipates the success of the plan that he suggested because it's rational, right? In everybody's best self-interest, we should treat everybody equally all the time. Everybody benefits. It would be silly, as he's writing, to conceive of a 2015 in which that wasn't the case. So, fine. I mean, the plan's going to work. The problem is this. A religious world is required in order to truly fulfill the promptings of his spirit. So on page 191, he writes, but once it's been achieved and humanity has reached its goal, what will it do then? Beyond that condition, there is no higher on earth. The generation which first has reached it can do nothing more than to persist in and vigorously maintain it, die, and leave offspring who will do the same. Mankind would then come to a halt in its path. Its earthly goal can therefore not be its highest goal. Right? You just get bored just kind of maintaining utopia. It seems kind of senseless after a while. And he makes a firmer case for this on the next page, 92. Our inner moral law would be empty and superfluous and would simply not benefit a being or befit a being which is incapable of more and is not destined to do something higher. To be at one with ourselves, we would have to refuse obedience to its voice and to suppress it as a perverted and foolish enthusiasm in us. No, I will not refuse it obedience. Let it be the innermost principle of my spiritual life. I cannot simply act for nothing for the sake of nothing. Right? So he postulates this utopia, realizes that he still have this inner voice driving him, and he doesn't want to deny that inner voice the truth of its calling. So his worry is that the goals of world peace and prosperity are too vast or distant, or that if they're accomplished, would leave humans purposeless. The spiritual for Fichte is too firmly intertwined within him to be able to discount. So there has to be a higher world beyond the one that he can see. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, you can just take it on faith. Fichte then proposes, 93, a quote, a new organ, and with it a new world that arises solely through the commandment of reason and connects only with that in my mind. It is nothing else at all but this necessary purpose itself, which my reason adds to the commandment. Right? So if I'm going to listen to the commandment, I have to reason that there's a higher world. Right? It has nothing to do with the Bible, has nothing to do with divine revelation. Reason itself decrees this is how it has to be. The stakes of this reasoning once again involve true freedom. He says, quote, if it were the whole intention of our existence to bring about an earthly condition of our species, then it would only require an infallible mechanism to determine our overt behavior, and we would need to be nothing more than wheels which fit well into the whole machine. Freedom would then not only be in vain, but it would even interfere, and the goodwill would be quite superfluous. So having a higher purpose than the earthly is important in order to allow something higher toward which we can work. But it still allows it as an option that isn't simply mechanical or duty-bound. It provides a ground of uncertainty beyond the clear, finite goal of human good. The foundation for working toward this new world is the will. Not a surprise, right? Does his argument at that point make sense, though? If it's only going to be, if we're only going for human good, then we're going to flatline. We're going to be duty-bound to do it. Like everybody has to do their part, and blah, blah, blah. But it's just as deterministic at that level because there's no uncertainty anymore. And he's understood the need for some uncertainty to work toward that gives us freedom. Without uncertainty, we lack freedom. Is that better? Okay. All right. Page 94. The eternal world rises more brightly before me. In it, the will is the pure and sole first link in a chain of consequences which runs through the entire invisible realm of spirits. Just as in the earthly world, the act, a certain movement of matter, becomes the first link in a material chain. The will is what is effective and alive in the world of reason. The will for Fichte then is pivotal. It allows interactions with both the material and the spiritual realm. Right? So if I'm going to act in the world, this is an act. I've reshaped the world. Will does in the spiritual world what my act does in this world. And I still have to will my act, but my will has higher consequences as well. So he's still trying to keep everything unified and tied together. Okay? Page 103. Fichte ends this chapter of book 3 by exhorting the reader to embrace the will. He says, only the improvement of the heart leads to true wisdom. Now then, may my whole life flow unceasingly toward this one purpose. Exclamation point. He's really excited about it. All right, book 4. In book 4, he offers his final articulation, his ultimate vision of life stripped of certainty. This view of the world involves an absolute spirit that provides the laws of the spiritual world toward which the will already inclines. So in 104, he says, the concept law expresses nothing other than reason's firm and unshakable adherence to a principle and the absolute impossibility of assuming the contrary. I assume such a law of the spiritual world, which is not given by my will, nor by the will of all finite beings taken together, right? So it's not just my will, and it's not just all of humanity's will, but to which my will and the will of all finite beings are themselves subject. So there's a higher will that all human wills bend toward. The law of the supersensible world would therefore be a will. The sublime will, therefore, does not go its own way separate from the rest of the rational world. Between it and all finite rational beings, there is a spiritual bond, and it itself is the spiritual bond of the world of reason. Okay? So at this point in the text, Fichte hopes to have convinced his reader that reason, especially when it's conjoined with will and the conscience that guides will, is not alien to the prospect of God. For Fichte, the idea of God in an eternal spiritual world are where reason necessarily guides us. And this ultimately leads Fichte to sum it up, the God will. Page 111 says, sublime living will, which no name can name and no concept encompass, well may I elevate my mind to you. For you and I are not separate. Your voice sounds in me and mine resounds in you. It sounds almost like a psalm, right? I mean, it really does. And he comes at it from this German romantic philosophical direction, but it ends up sounding like a prayer or a psalm in a very poetic and plain sort of way. I just picked it out because I like it. Page 115. Fichte describes the results of his meditation on faith, and they're in stark contrast to the results of pursuing doubt and knowledge. Okay? So before he was in anguish, he was in agony, like, oh, I'm in dread, I'm in despair. Here's how he ends book 4. He says, blessed be the hour in which I decided to reflect on myself and my vocation. All my questions are answered. I know what I can know, and I don't worry about what I can't know. I am satisfied. There is perfect harmony and clarity in my mind, and a new and splendid existence begins for me. I raise myself to this standpoint, and am a new creature, and my whole relationship to the present world is transformed. The ties by which my mind was so far attached to this world are cut forever, and I stand free and calm and unmoved, myself, my own world. It is no longer with the heart that I apprehend objects and connect with them, but only with the eye. And this eye itself is clarified in freedom and sees through error and deformities of the true and the beautiful. I care only to know one thing, what I ought to do, and this I always know infallibly. So Fichte ends up achieving absolute certainty and clarity. And it comes through suspending reason and adhering to the call of will that surpasses reason without violating it. Right? He's not looking to break reason or act irrationally. He just needs something that surpasses will in order to give him a direction and conviction. It begins with the material, and it ends with the spiritual, and bridging into the spiritual world without being divorced from it. And that lets him have everything he wanted through everything else. He just had to let go of his need for certainty first. And that's book 4. Condensed, but in a nutshell. Does that make sense? All right. Here's some conclusions. There are 4 of them. Number 1. Fichte, I think, makes an excellent case for the need to move beyond fate and freedom. And he acknowledges the space for anguish, anger, will, and conscience as entities that we need to heed. Right? So if there's fate on one hand, freedom on the other, he looks at faith as kind of a middle way between those. Number 2. Relative to Oedipus, it would seem that adhering to Fichte's program would have lessened the degrees of evil that were prominent throughout the story of the play. Most of the problems were caused by a drive for knowledge. So Laius and Jocasta wanted to protect themselves, maybe their son, from the horrors of the prophecy. Oedipus wanted to do the same. But in attempting to will with a limited certainty, they ended up fulfilling the prophecy that they wanted to avoid. Right? They were acting on, they wanted it to be certain, and their need for certainty confirmed it rather than defeated it, which is what their hopes had done. Number 3, heeding faith and living with a good will would at the very least have helped Laius and Oedipus at the crossroads. They would have been able to understand the value of life, the need for peace and reason, and they therefore could have avoided the conflict that had propelled Oedipus into his unfortunate lot. Right? If Oedipus would have had more faith that Laius was an equal, rational being with whom he could converse, there wouldn't have been the angry fight that led to Laius' death. That's faith. So that's it. And then not everybody has the same kind of view of faith that Fichte has. In 2 weeks, we're going to look at Sartre, who talks about bad faith, and the way that Fichte's solution, which is hard-earned, seems unfortunately akin to self-deception. So that's in 2 weeks. But next week, we're going to take a break and dive into some detective fiction. We'll look at Chandler's The Simple Art of Murder and read the title essay, which is the beginning, and then the first story in the book, which is called Spanish Blood. So that's what we'll be talking about next week. Any other questions?
Did you tell us number 4?
Oh, that was number 4. I mean, number 4 is that. I mean, faith, Fichte makes faith sound awesome. Sartre in 2 weeks is going to talk about bad faith. And I mean, it sounds great from Fichte's standpoint, but it's not universally embraced as a real alternative to what's going on. So we're going to look at things from a lot of different perspectives. Other questions?
So again, you said the reading material is Chandler's and
It's a book called The Simple Art of Murder. It's a book of short stories, but it comes with an essay at the beginning that Chandler wrote about what it means to write detective fiction. And so we'll look at I'll talk about the essay, and then I'll talk about the first story called Spanish Blood.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for coming.